Hey friends, I'm Sharon Betters, and this is the Help and Hope podcast produced by MARKINC Ministries. I am really excited to talk with our guests today, Kathy Chapell and Elizabeth Turnage. If you listen to the Help and Hope podcast, you know that we had a conversation not long ago about telling our stories in a way that gives hope to the next generation and being intentional about how we communicate what God has done in our lives, even though there might be disappointments and potholes, that even those things, and maybe most of all those things, He uses to give hope to those coming behind us. But as we wrapped up our conversation, we realized there was this whole big piece that we had not touched on. And so I am so glad that Kathy and Elizabeth agreed to come back to talk about how we can better care for elderly parents in particular, but elderly people in general. And one of the reasons why we want to talk about this is because Kathy spent 4 days taking her older mother on a trip to a family reunion. And she tells about that trip in her book, The Great Iowa Road Trip, which is delightful and has so many great stories. But she also learned a lot, not just about her mother, but about herself. And she shares those lessons learned, and we're going to talk about them today. And Elizabeth also has experience in caring for elderly parents, in particular, the last season of life, of helping them prepare for that last season and even walking through that last season. So this is going to be a rich conversation, and I'm so glad that you joined us. So Elizabeth and Kathy, you are both authors, you are both grandmothers, you are both speakers. You have such incredible, rich lives. And you can mention any of that in the next few minutes, because I would like for each of you to take a few minutes to introduce yourselves to us and tell us one thing that you just do for fun. Kathy, why don't you start?
Aha, you didn't warn us about that one. I'm Kathy Chapell. Yes, mother of 4 grown children and their 4 wonderful spouses, grandmother of 6 at this point. And I'm a Midwesterner, now transplanted to Atlanta, Georgia, because of Brian's work with the PCA. A fun thing about me, I love to read mystery books. And for a long time, Sherlock Holmes was my deal. But it's been Agatha Christie for years now. And I just enjoy. I enjoy the unfolding of the plot, the revealing of the bad guy, and the resolution, which I most recently have related to, oh, this is what the Bible is. You guys, the characters are introduced at the beginning, but the plot's already planned from beginning to end. Bad guys identified, the story proceeds. Now think Agatha Christie as well as the Bible, and then the detective reveals the bad guy's defeated, carted off to prison, and all is well. That's the Bible. And realizing that helped me appreciate the Bible more, the whole long story, but it also helped me appreciate Agatha Christie. So anyway, that's my deal. I enjoy reading. I fish with my husband. We do some hiking and walking. We visit our grandkids, and it's a good life. Lord is good.
Good. And I love the way that Brian has been a friend to my husband in particular over the years as pastors. It's been very, very sweet to see. And so how about you, Elizabeth?
Well, I'm also a mother of 4, and 3 of our 4 are married, and each of those 3 had babies in 2022. And so we are now grandchildren and getting ready for a beach week with all 3 of these little ones. And there's one on the way due in November. So this is our season of just growing. And one fun thing I like to do to relax is watercoloring, which I am not very good at. I haven't had any lessons. I do like online tutorials, and I love Let's Make Art with Sarah Cray. she just says, she makes you take this little pledge that says you're going to have fun and you're not going to compare your work. And she always says, it's only a piece of paper, just paint, don't worry about it. And so that's kind of been a relaxing thing that I like to do in the evenings. I read a lot during the day for my work as a writer and speaker. So I read a little bit at night before I go to bed, but I like to watercolor after my husband and I hang out for a while. That's what I like to do. And maybe one day I'll get better at it, but so far
maybe you'll be illustrating your books in the future. Who knows?
That's a long way off.
Well, who knows? But it's wonderful. I'm glad to hear about that. I didn't know that about you. And I'm going to include more information about Kathy and Elizabeth in the show notes, so that you will know how to get in touch with them and learn more about them and the ministries that they have. God has just given them both beautiful callings. And again, I'm grateful to both of you for joining us. So Kathy, you wrote this really great book called The Great Iowa Road Trip. And we talked about it in our last podcast. And I could resonate with some of the stories you were sharing, but what seemed to be a recurring theme for you was really spending the time with your mother in an enclosed space in a car and getting to know things about her that you maybe knew before, but they weren't that big of a deal because they were very infrequent. You weren't with her for hours at a time. But at the end of the book, you write about some of the lessons learned in this road trip that I think are invaluable for caring for elderly people. And the first thing you said was, I don't know everything. And I thought, well, we all probably would say, I don't know everything. But in this context, what did you mean? And how did that change the way that you got along with your mom?
I don't have a problem saying I don't know everything, but I thought I knew my mother. I mean, she was my mother. Yes. I had lived with her for the first 20-ish years of my life, but I hadn't lived with her after that. After Brian and I were married, we just celebrated 45 years. I hadn't lived with her. We lived about an hour and a half away from my mom and dad for most of that time. And so we would visit, they would visit, the kids came, that made the visits more fun. But they were visits either on their turf or my turf, and they were special occasions. And then after Dad died in 2008, and about 6 months later, Mom moved from that family home to North Carolina. So now all of a sudden, I'm in St. Louis, she's in North Carolina. And it was an event when I went to visit her. And I would stay 2 or 3 days. But again, it was an event. And there were things that surprised me about my mom in those events. Like I didn't see the energy I was used to seeing in her. I didn't see kind of that joy of life that I was used to. I watched her grow less able physically. But again, those were short little events. I hadn't lived with her. Then on that trip, 4 days, as you say, in an enclosed space where there's no, there's no getting away. When I needed to roll my eyes or take a deep breath, she's just next to me in the seat, right? So, and neither of us were in our own homes. So that was harder than I thought. And that's when it came to me, oh, not only do I not know everything, I don't really know her anymore. So that was the beginning. I needed to learn how to love her again. I needed to learn better ways to love her. And it needed to be done immediately. Now, that was that 4 days. That was in 2012. Mom died in 2017. So I had several years after that to kind of put into practice the things that occurred to me on that trip. And I'm thankful. I'm really thankful for that. So I had to learn. I'll start, but Sharon, interrupt me anytime. You sent me some really great questions. And so I can kind of address them on a surface level now, and then you can interrupt me if you want.
Okay.
I had not fully, I think the first thing I came to understand then and over the years was I had not fully realized the depth of loss that my mom suffered when Dad died. Again, I had not lived with them for all those years, but they lived with each other for 60 years. And they had a great marriage, and they were good to each other, and they were good for each other. And then he died. He was diagnosed with lymphoma, and a month later he was gone. And 6 months later, Mom moved from that house of 55 years to a new house. She had to downsize all her things. She had to give away furniture. She had to give away dishes. She had to downsize drastically to move to this small house. It was a great little house. She was 5 minutes away from one sister, about 20 minutes away from another sister. But she had had the same phone number for 55 years. She lived in the same time zone for 55 years. She had seen the same newscasters on her television. I mean, the depth of loss I had not processed. So she lost her whole life, basically. She was living, but nothing was the way she knew. And I was expecting her to be the same from what I knew. And that was wrong. That was, it was not cruelty on my part. It was just, I didn't know. So I had to grapple with that, as well as my expectations for the trip.
And I just want to jump in here because I'm thinking of a friend who has experienced this, and her children who they just don't understand. They to the point of deep resentment and anger, because they feel as though when they lost their dad, they lost her too. But there doesn't seem to be insight into that loss, recognizing the loss that she experienced is different than their loss. Because I think there's that other side that says, well, I lost him too, but there's a different feeling there. Can you talk about that for a minute? I mean, help these adult children understand a little bit more, although I think you've done a beautiful job already.
I think the years as my parents age, and we would take our children to visit them. And particularly my older son, who has always been very sensitive to adults. And he would say to me, isn't it beautiful the way Grandma and Grandpa love each other? They walk hand in hand. When the receipt comes at the restaurant that they've taken us to, they look at it together. That was our impression, how they love each other, and they did. But we didn't fathom was how they, both elderly, after 60 years, they were like this. And now we've pulled him away. We didn't realize that they were walking hand in hand because she was wobbly. She needed a new knee. And she didn't want to do that. So he would walk hand in hand with her. He would stabilize her. They would look at the receipts together at the restaurant because he was suffering from macular degeneration. He couldn't read the receipts. Did they tell us that? They did not. They were proud people, but they had each other, so they didn't have to tell us. They got along great. To your point, Sharon, about the adult children who say, when we lost dad, we lost mom too. We felt that. And our children said, when Grandpa died, we lost Grandma. But it was Dad that kept the calendar. So it was Dad that would say, oh, Audrey, it's Kathy's birthday. Let's call her. And they would call at 5:30 in the morning and sing happy birthday. They would call our grandkids. They would send birthday cards to our grandkids. And so now Dad's gone. And now her life has no anchor of Dad looking at the calendar and saying, oh, Audrey. So she didn't think about it. Or maybe she thought about it a week later. But I missed it. My mom wasn't calling me on the day that I was born to her. And I was hurt. And so I started calling her on my birthday. And I would say, happy birthday to me. Happy birthday to me. Happy birthday, dear mama. Aren't you glad that I was born? So we didn't realize the depth and expanse of the loss because they had been so bound together. Yes, I lost Dad. She lost the love of her life, her partner for life. Lord willing, I won't know that. Lord willing, the Lord takes us both home at the same time, Brian and me. But that's what Mom was experiencing.
Yeah. So when you talk about learning ways to love her better, what were some of those ways? I mean, I would think that one of the ways was to acknowledge she wasn't going to call you on your birthday. Somehow moving past that hurt and calling her would be a step. But what are some of the other ways that you learned to love her in a different way?
And there's so many, I have pages of notes, but
for your book. It's for your next book.
Yeah. Well, and things I addressed in the book. I think the big revelation, and you've read the book and you're so generous in your praise, was on day 3. On days 1 and 2, I was afraid I might strangle her. I was so frustrated because she read every road sign out loud. And she's not the only lady, little old lady who does this. I have talked to my friends and we all roll our eyes and, comfort one another. She would read every road sign out loud, every speed limit, and then lean over and check my speed. Every exit sign. On the 3rd day, and we're driving across Iowa. Now, northern Iowa is just flat forever. And so I was trying to make up things to talk about. And at one point, we came up to an intersection of 2 highways, and it had been updated since she'd been there. So she looked around and she said, this isn't right. We're not in the right place. I said, oh, but we are, because I know everything, right? She got out her map yet again. She looked at it. She looked down. She looked up. She looked down. We're not right. It's not right. She was so angry. She just slammed the map down on her lap. And she said, if they would just leave things the way they were, I would always know where I am. Okay. I've been praying so many times, Lord, help me. Lord, help me. I don't know what to do about this. All of a sudden, boom, the Holy Spirit went, Kathy, listen to what she just said. If things were always the way they were, I would know where I am. And suddenly I realized she doesn't know where she is. And that frightens her. We'd been, by that time, 3 days, 2 nights away from her house. She'd been in that little house for 9 years, so she was used to it. We'd been away from her house. We'd been away from her refrigerator, her Folgers instant coffee, her everything. We were living out of suitcases in hotel rooms, seeing sights. She was totally out of where she knew where she was. And now they had the gall to change the intersection. But that made me think, she does not want to live in today. This trip was about living in memories. And I've been trying to cram her into today. I need to let her be in her memories. That changed everything for me. And I started asking questions that let her live in her memories. I think my first one might have been, and candidly, I don't remember what I wrote was the first one, but I think the first one was, Mom, I never met your dad. Tell me, when you were a little girl, what was your daddy like? What color was his hair? And she was surprised that I would ask that question. Well, she said, it was brown. It was a little bit reddish. Oh, nice. What did his voice sound like? Did he talk loudly or did he talk softly? She answered that. What was his walk like? I just started asking her questions that let her like leapfrog backwards to her memories. And all of a sudden, it was like a dam burst. And she was all about telling me stories. And I was, wiping away the tears because I thought, thank you, Lord, you have helped me understand what this trip should have been. You asked, how did this trip change my heart? And I had to realize how really self-oriented I am. And I want to stress a difference, I think, between selfish and self-oriented. I had to learn that when my kids turned into teenagers. And I had to realize that teenagers and toddlers both view life coming at them in terms of how it affects them. That doesn't mean they're selfish, it means they're self-oriented. All they can process is, how does this affect me? And that's what I was being. I was being, what will this trip mean to me? What will I learn on this trip? Who will I meet on this trip? I'm taking Mom on this trip. I'm doing this. Pretty cool, right? I'm pretty cool. I had to turn my back on that attitude and replace it with, what does this trip mean to her? What do these memories mean to her? If I ask her about a fact, and if she remembers it, which she may not, she was pretty forgetful at that point. If she remembers that fact, what does that mean to her? And why is that really important? That was the change in my heart, it's about her. It's not about me.
I appreciate you saying that. And I think it really is the thread that goes through our whole conversation in these relationships. And Elizabeth, you had recently written an article. It's called When Moving Our Aging Parents Become Necessary. And I think this goes right along with learning new ways of loving our elderly parents. You wrote, our story with my dad reveals a common caregiver struggle. As caregivers, we seek the safety of our loved one, and in so doing, we sometimes ignore or minimize their desires. In our commitment to safety, we can also make the mistake of treating adults as if they were children, unable to make wise decisions for themselves. Even when dementia or disease prevents our loved ones from thinking clearly, we still must care for them with compassion and respect. To learn how to navigate this challenging terrain, we must remain centered on Christ's compassion. This is really good counsel, but what does that look like practically? Because I think especially if the parent is difficult, it's hard to be around them for many reasons. What does it look like to care for them compassionately in these circumstances?
Sharon, I think that what Kathy has already said about, starting with humility, I don't know everything. And then looking to Jesus. And I mean, we just really need Jesus so desperately when we're trying to care for our aging parents, because even if they're not really difficult, it may be difficult for us. We move at a certain pace and we have our ideas of what is right. And particularly when it comes to caring for an aging parent who is sick or dealing with diminished ability to care for themselves, or, you know, in my case, my dad had terminal cancer. And so we made this decision, you know, suddenly the tumors had spread to his bones and his hips. So we were concerned about his safety walking and getting up downstairs at his house. And my brother and I just made this very quick decision that we're going to get him moved. And in that article, I wrote about how I wish what I wish I had done differently. And I thought about Jesus's compassion and how Jesus looked at people. And so we want to start by looking at this person. And I think that's what Kathy was talking about, is looking at this person. Oh, I don't know everything about this person. And how Jesus looked at people was he saw the whole person, and he saw their physical needs, and he saw their emotional needs and their spiritual needs. We need to, we're looking, I wear glasses, we're looking through so often as the daughter or son of an aging parent, we're looking through our own lens of maybe fear for their safety or our desire to control the situation. They are trying to control their own situation with some of the quirky things that they're doing. So that's one. The second is to listen. And again, I just go back to what Kathy did. As you read her book, you see that she asked questions. She was curious. She listened. And we want to listen as Jesus listened. I mean, you think about it, Jesus knew the answers to all the questions that he asked, but he asked questions and he showed compassion as he did ask those questions. With Bartimaeus, he said, Bartimaeus was blind, and he said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And, you know, you might think, well, that's obvious, but he asked that question to allow Bartimaeus to think about, what do I want? What do I need? How do I need Jesus? And so I think it's a really good strategy to listen and to ask questions. And that's what I wrote about in the article, that I wish, you know, we just said, you know, we're moving you to this assisted living. I never asked my dad, what do you want me to do for you? And even though we may have come to the same conclusion that he still needed to move, it would have showed so much more compassion if we had asked questions and if we had listened and allowed him to voice his desires for what he wanted. You know, again, that it's too late for me. So, but it's not too late for your listeners to, you know, the family that you were talking about, Sharon, that, you know, are feeling resentful. It's really a reorientation. And as Christians, we have this capacity because we're united with Christ. So we can have the compassion of Christ. And then the third very practical thing that I think we can do is point our aging parents to the hope of the gospel. That's what Jesus did. And he, you know, he recognized their sin. And he, of course, had the capacity to forgive their sin, which we don't have that capacity. But where we may not want to say, well, Dad, you're being really sinful because you're being prideful and not wanting to move from your home. I'm not suggesting that as a strategy, but I think if we can recognize, I've got sin and my dad has sin. We're two sinners in this situation, and we both need the forgiveness of Christ, and we need Christ's help. And so we can not only recognize their sin, but we can also recognize how God has worked in them. And so, you know, how we can say, yeah, he's probably being pretty sinful in calling his assisted living Shawshank, which is what he used to call his assisted living, which is the prison in a movie, if you don't know that movie. But that was his joke, his little joke. But we can say, you know, Dad, I see how you love people well by, he talked to every person in that, you know, who served him in that cafeteria and in, you know, in the place all over the place, all the helpers. He just praised them and thanked them. And so we can really point to the beauty of Christ in them, and also, where appropriate, in a way that's appropriate, remind them that they need forgiveness too. So those are just a few things that I found as I began to think about loving our aging parents with the compassion of Christ.
Well,
Elizabeth,
go ahead, Kathy.
Elizabeth, we had the same reflection. I have had the same reflection about when we said, Mom, you need to move. The house that she lived in, that Dad built, required her going up and downstairs every day, sometimes several times a day. And we were convinced that any moment we would get a call that she'd fallen. And, so basically the siblings got together and said, yes, this is what, and if you've read the book, my brother just went out and bought her a house. I mean, he just said, and I remember her saying to me, why do I need to move? And our saying, because it's best for you. You're not safe here. But as I've reflected on it in the ensuing years, I think, what if my son or my daughter, what if one of my children came to our home and said, Mom and Dad, you need to move now because we believe that it's best for you. That's my kid. Where's my ability to control? And I think as adult children, it's important to realize your parents still sees you as their child, and to be told. Now, as people age or deal with illness or whatever, the filters fall away, and sometimes that logic train jumps the track, and their world gets smaller and smaller. And now you're saying, and now your world is what I determine. Yeah. Very hard, very hard. And I think, I wish we had done it better. Mm. I wish we had been more patient. Why were we in such a hurry? Because we were frightened for her. But I think we could have done it better. And I just know that now that she's in glory, she understands fully. That's my prayer.
I appreciate you saying, I wish we had done it better, because one of the purposes of this podcast is for our guests to be further along in life's journey and to be calling back with the encouragement and the comfort and the wisdom and the counsel that they can give. They're further along. You're further along than others. And there are those who are right in the middle of this right now, who are going to be so grateful for you being willing to be vulnerable and to share. I wish I had done it differently. Elizabeth, in your article, you have a story that it really moved me to tears. It was about a son whose mother, she needed to move, and she really was not cooperating. Can you tell us that story, and what did the son do that helped change her thinking?
Yeah, so he had been, again, a situation that many of us find ourselves in, trying to help a parent downsize. And he had been working with his mother all morning, and he would pick up a little teacup that had a chip on it and say, well, this can go. Or he would pick up an old doll that was his sister's doll. And it was his sister's doll, and she didn't care about it. So he's like, well, we can give this away. And, things like that. And she kept saying, no, no, we can't get, and he just got very, very frustrated. And so he was wise enough to say, I need to take a break. And so he left, and, he had come from out of town to do this. And so he left, but he began praying about it. And as he prayed, he began to remember, my mother drank from this teacup. This was her mother's, and she drank from this all of her life, and it reminds her of her mother. And then he began to think about how that doll was his sister's doll when their dad left. And so he began to connect that these objects were connected to stories that were so important to his mother. And I want to mention two things that I read in a book called How to Say It to Seniors. And this man works in the psychology of aging. And he says there are two things that seniors are really motivated by. And one is, and this is not surprising, the legacy, having a meaningful legacy. And the second is the desire for control. And we already kind of talked about that with, talking about moving our parents. But the same thing is true over like wanting to control, like, these are my possessions and you can't tell me what to do with my possessions. So as he began to pray and think and remember and recognize that these objects were connected to stories with his mother, then he was able to go back and he was able to say, hey, Mom, tell me, back to what Kathy did, tell me some of the stories that these things are connected to. And then he was able, as he asked her to tell the stories, he was also able to say, we need to give away some things. We need to get rid of some things. And I know this makes you sad. And as soon as he was able to name the grief that she had and having to let go of these things, she was sad, and she was able to agree with him that it made her sad, but she was also able, much more open to letting go of them, and even saying, okay, well, we'll write down, we'll just write a sentence for each one of these things. Like, this doll is important to me because, and, just write the things down and then be able to put them in the giveaway pile. So that was a great story for me to remember. Again, I'm not in this place for my parents anymore, but I am in this place for myself of just remembering that I need to be constantly thinking about what to keep and what to give away.
Yeah, I think that's one of the hardest things. And especially for somebody like me, who, if a child touches it, I'm saving it. So my poor kids, I try to clean out. I do. I'm telling you, kids, if you ever listen to this, I'm trying, but I end up putting it in a box and put it up in the attic and think they can take care of it when I'm not here. But I just think that's such a beautiful story. And everything you're saying, the two of you, it's tying together. It's really acknowledging the image of God in our parents, and recognizing the emotions and allowing them to have these emotions, and saying that it's okay. These are right emotions to have. We haven't been there, like Kathy said. I don't know everything about my parents, and so it is definitely a learning experience as we go along. One of the things, Kathy, that I think everybody can probably relate to, that you talked about, was your mom. When some of the stories she told, she would get some of the details wrong. In your opinion, she was wrong in her storytelling, and at first you corrected her repeatedly, because she would tell the same story with the same mistakes in it, and then something changed for you. What did you realize about her storytelling, and even some of the other quirkiness that she had that you didn't realize were so ingrained in her?
Well, the story that changed me was, as she was talking, I was talking about having visited England, having visited England with Brian. And she started talking about, yes, England. You remember when Keith, parentheses to you, Keith is my brother, Bob is my dad. She said, when Keith was in World War II and he was injured and he was shipped to a hospital in England, and he always wanted to take me back there to see it. And I said, well, Mom, that wasn't Keith. That was Bob. That was Dad. She was silent. She looked out the window and she was flushed. And then she said, I forget so many things. And it struck me, why did I correct her? And in such a tender mistake to use my brother's name instead of dad's name, instead of the man that she had loved and been married to. So later when she wanted to tell me about why my brother was bald, and I won't go into that on the podcast, but my brother is bald, as was her dad, as was her, the male pattern baldness. But she was blaming it. Keith had a run-in with cancer, and she was blaming it on the cancer treatments he had when he was in high school. And I said, I don't think that's why he's bald now. I think that's male pattern baldness. She insisted. And finally, I just let it go. I thought, okay, what's really seared into her memory is when her only son, her firstborn child, battled cancer, for which the survival rate was about 20% in that day. And he lived, and he thrived, and he became a surgeon, largely because of that medical experience. That's what she holds on to. Okay, let her blame baldness, whatever she wants on that. It's okay. I don't need to be right. The forgetfulness is real, but I don't need to be right. That's my own issues with control, right? So that was a huge lesson and changed all my conversations with her thereafter. She knew. I do also want to say, at some point when my youngest child was listening to her grandma, my mom, be forgetful. And Katie said to me later, Mom, what's wrong with grandma? And I said to her, and I remind myself of this, grandma's forgetfulness is not her fault, nor is it her failure. It's a result of many years of life and many years of living each day to the best of her ability, of living each day, going to bed at night exhausted, waking up the next day, ready for action. That's the reality. The forgetfulness is going to happen. Some sooner than later will suffer it. But it's going to happen to us. And we have to not see it as this horrible failure. We have to see it as this is part of life. And it's a part that we may regret advancing upon us. But the Lord is still in control. Our life is still written in his book. And rather than be angry or frustrated, we need to say, yes, Lord, help me to be patient here with her, as I hope others will be patient with me as it comes.
I think you raise a really good point here is, first of all, God's view of aging is Psalm 92, Psalm 71. He gives us a calling in our last season of life to continue to reflect him and bear much fruit, but the fruit bearing is all about him when we're planted in his house and in his word, and he's the one that grows the fruit in our lives. But it's a different view of aging than what our culture has of aging. And I love what you said to your daughter about her grandmother. And what an example of what are we communicating about our aging parents or anyone who is aging? What is our perspective and our view? And our culture is not kind to older people. The forgetfulness and the quirkiness and all those things, instead of, as you just said, it's really the fruit of a well-lived life, a full life. And it's part of the natural process of how God has created us. There's a lot of demeaning and disrespect and dishonor. I think we need to remember that what we are reflecting to our children is what they're going to reflect to their children as well. And so we're modeling for the next generation. how to care for the elderly. I'm 75, so some would say, well, you are elderly. And so you're talking about yourself here. And I think about my own children, and I'm going to make sure they listen to this so that they can see the perspective. But we're going to be wrapping up soon. But I wanted to ask a question about how, when my mother was in her last season of life, she was very ill. But those who didn't know her would not, when she went out, she would dress up and put her makeup on, and they would have a hard time believing that she had to crawl up the steps because her heart was so weak. And so she dressed every morning. She got up and she got dressed and was ready for her day, even if it was sitting on the sofa in front of the fireplace all day long. On the other hand, I had another friend who, same kind of situation, where she just kind of gave up. She would not get dressed in the mornings. She would sit in her recliner and feel very bad for herself and just did not take care of herself. What is the balance as a child, an adult child, to help our parents continue to stay engaged with life? Because the response of the one who has given up is, you have no idea. You wait until you're my age, wait until you're where I am. So Elizabeth, do you have any, what would be your thoughts there on how to help a parent enjoy life, or when to know just to let them make up their own minds?
Yeah, as with so many of the challenges that we face with aging parents, we've got to start with prayer and seeking wisdom. And I would say also going back to thinking about having the compassion of Christ for this parent, and thinking about starting with empathy. We've talked a lot about that on this program. And so try to really put yourself in that person's shoes, in that mother's shoes, and think, oh, what would that be like to try to get dressed and maybe if, like, I've had shoulder surgery a number of times, and it's very hard, it's very painful, and it's exhausting when your body is limited. And so starting with empathy and trying to understand. And then the other thing that I think is really important is to affirm anytime you see that person doing anything that does require that effort, and to name that, to think, oh, that took a lot of effort for you to get into that chair. Wow, that, and thank you for taking the time to have a conversation with me, because it takes energy to have a conversation. So I do think that we can start by looking to praise and to understand. And then when we have laid that groundwork, starting with the compassion of looking and listening and praying and praising, then we may have the opportunity to challenge and to say, studies show that older people who are more engaged with other people, who do things with other people, who have conversations with other people, that they are happier and they are healthier. And so, maybe in a positive way, still trying to challenge that person to make that effort. But when they know that they're going to get a lot of praise for making that effort, that makes a difference. I think that lots of times we just we assume it's just like for us to get dressed and get downstairs, and we don't stop to think, that's hard. Oh, wow, thank you for taking the time to come downstairs today so I could be with you. That's where I would go with that. Always back to prayer for wisdom, the compassion of Christ, and then where we can, challenging that assumption, I can't do this.
I think the next step too, and I'm sure you would agree with this, would be when we're saying, studies show that you're going to be healthier, is to say, what can I do to help you? What can I do? Can I help you get dressed? Can we Can we spend the day together? Can we, can we, maybe I could take you out for lunch, something like that, so that you're getting the person back involved. They don't feel like you don't know how hard this is. But when you say, well, I'll help you, and you're meeting so many needs in that level, because then they have some time to spend with a person that they wouldn't be spending it with, and they feel better about getting up and moving around. So that could be a whole nother podcast where we talk about how to physically help elderly people, and also the church having a spirit of servanthood and care that models for the next generation how to care for elderly as God has commanded us to, and has provided his word to show us how to do that. Well, I hate to wrap up our time together. I could talk to you guys all day. I wish we were neighbors so that we could enjoy being with one another and just, chatting without any limits, but we do need to wrap up. And I wanted to ask you, could you encourage that person who is caring for an elderly parent? Maybe the parent really is difficult to be around. What encouragement would you give to that person as they're preparing to be with that elderly parent, maybe later today? Elizabeth, why don't you start? And then Kathy, you can wrap us up.
Yeah, I would just say, you are like, this is hard, and know that it is hard especially when the parent that you're caring for, if they're, particularly difficult. I know that, I've had friends who are caring for parents who are outright unkind, mean to them. And that is such a hard calling. And so first, just blessings and peace and, on you. And it's very important to have a good community and support structure to encourage you in that, because it is so hard. And with that, then going back to, praying for strength and patience and endurance, and for that compassion of Christ, because it doesn't come naturally when we're, Christ says that, we are called to love our enemies, and the parent may seem like an enemy in that situation. Mm-hmm. So just, and asking others to pray for you to be able to have that compassion.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Kathy?
And forgive me if I cough in the middle. I echo what Elizabeth said. I did find it. Now, both my parents are gone. Brian's mother is still living, and actually finding other people in my age and stage to sit down and say, oh, I'm really struggling this week. I'm really struggling with this. My sister Karen lived 5 minutes away from Mom. And so she would call me frequently and saying, this is what's going on today. To have someone with whom you can vent and then maybe laugh and then pray together. It is hard. And reading Elizabeth's articles, reading Sharon, your book, Aging with Grace, that you co-wrote with Susan Hunt, just to understand you're not the only one in the fight. You're not the only one in this situation, and to get ideas from others. Mm. And then I also think it will require sacrifice on your part. It will. And that's the nature of the beast. Remember that your mother changed your diapers. Mm-hmm. Remember that she kept you safe. Remember that she labored and birthed you. And so why would you not, at this other end of her life, be what she needs you to be? It will be sacrificial in many cases. My mother was never unpleasant to me. My father was never unpleasant to me. There are those who struggle with that, and I don't have an anecdote to solve that problem, but realize it will be sacrificial. Find your friends, pray, and reflect Christ. You are the hands and face of Christ in this situation. And that's a pretty amazing calling.
So right. That's a beautiful way for us to wrap up this conversation. We are the hands and face of Christ. And we pray that he is always reflecting his love to those around us, and thanking the Lord for the community that he has given to us, where there are people who can walk that pathway with us. I'm Sharon Betters, and this is the Help and Hope podcast. And my guests today have been Elizabeth Turnage and Kathy Chapell. And you can connect with them on their websites. Kathy, what is your website?
KathyChapell.com. It's Chapel with 1 P and 2 L's. Kathy Chapell. Oh, Kathy with a K.
Okay, Kathy with a K, KathyChapell.com, and Elizabeth?
ElizabethTurnage.com.
ElizabethTurnage.com, and I will have all this information in the show notes, but I highly recommend anything that these two women write, the coaching that Elizabeth gives in helping us to prepare for that last season of life and believing our stories as a pathway to hope for the next generation. You can go to helpandhopenow.org. That's our website where you can find more resources like this. And I look forward to being with you another time. Thank you so much for joining us. And we hope that you will share with others this podcast and the help and hope that only Jesus can give.